When Jason and Emily Hartwell first laid eyes on the mid-century modern home nestled in the Hollywood Hills, they couldn't believe their luck. The real estate agent had whispered that it once belonged to George Maharis, the actor known for Route 66, but neither of them were old enough to have watched the show. What mattered was the house itself, sleek, spacious, and with breathtaking views of Los Angeles. The price had been surprisingly low for the area, which the agent explained away as a motivated seller situation. That first night, as they sipped wine on the balcony overlooking the city, Emily sighed in contentment. "Can you believe this?" she murmured. "It's perfect." Jason nodded, though something about the house made him feel unsettled. It was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made silence feel occupied. Their dog, Winston, seemed to agree. He paced restlessly through the house, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. When Jason tried to call him to bed, the golden retriever simply sat in the hallway, staring at the darkened living room, tail stiff. That was the first night. The next morning, Jason awoke with a start. It wasn't the alarm or the sunrise through the glass walls, it was the scent. A sharp, distinct smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air. But neither he nor Emily smoked. "Do you smell that?" he asked, sitting up. Emily groaned, pulling the covers over her head. "No, go back to sleep." Jason climbed out of bed, following the scent through the house. It was strongest in the den, where Maharis had reportedly spent most of his later years. The smell lingered, dense and stale, but as soon as Jason flipped on the light, it vanished. He shook his head and went back to bed. Maybe the old owner had been a smoker, and the smell had settled into the walls. Nothing to worry about. But over the next few days, the house continued to prove it wasn't quite empty. Winston refused to enter the den. Lights flickered, despite the wiring being newly updated. The faint sound of a TV turning on, always playing an old black and white show, would drift through the house. But when they checked, nothing was there. Then came the whispers. It began as a feeling, subtle, creeping, a sensation that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored. The kind of thing you dismiss in the daylight but find impossible to shake in the dead of night. Jason first noticed it in the den, sitting in the deep leather armchair Maharis had reportedly favored. The room had a peculiar weight to it, as if time itself had thickened, pressing in from the past. The air held a stillness that wasn't natural, too expectant, too hushed, as though the house was waiting for something or someone. The scent of cigarette smoke returned, stronger this time, clinging to the fabric of the furniture, seeping into the wood. It was acrid and sharp, not like the faint trace of a past habit but fresh, recent, as if someone had been sitting beside him, exhaling slow streams of ghostly vapor into the air. He turned to Winston, who sat stiffly in the doorway, ears pinned back. The dog let out a low, uneasy whimper and backed away. That night, the house spoke in ways it hadn't before. Emily had already gone to bed, and Jason lingered in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, trying to push away the unsettling thoughts from earlier. The wind stirred the trees outside, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. But inside the house, there was a different kind of movement. A low murmur, indistinct, soft, threading its way through the hallway like a conversation just out of reach. Jason froze. He wasn't imagining it. The sound had texture and edge of breath, the cadence of speech, as if someone were standing just beyond sight, engaged in a quiet but insistent exchange. He stepped forward, holding his breath, ears straining. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. Emily's voice rang out from the bedroom, groggy and irritated. "Jason, are you talking to someone?" "No," he called back, pulse quickening. A pause. Then, softer, "Come to bed." He hesitated, staring down the dimly lit hallway. The murmurs had stopped, but the air still felt charged, humming with an unseen presence. He turned off the kitchen light and made his way to the bedroom, forcing himself not to glance back. But he didn't sleep that night, because just before dawn something else happened. Jason had finally drifted into a light, uneasy slumber when he felt a pressure, gentle at first, then firmer, as though a hand was pressing down on his chest. He gasped, jolting awake, but no one was there. Only the darkness, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The air smelled of tobacco, cold and bitter, and from the far side of the room, near the doorway, a shadow shifted. Not a trick of the light, not his imagination. Something was there. Jason lay frozen, his breath caught somewhere between his ribs, his heart hammering against the weight on his chest. The darkness of the bedroom felt too thick, too full, as if it had substance beyond just the absence of light. His eyes strained against the dimness, trying to separate the ordinary shadows from the thing standing near the doorway. It wasn't just a shape, it had presence. The air around it seemed denser, colder, like the space itself had congealed into something almost solid. The figure wasn't moving, but Jason could feel it watching, the kind of gaze that prickled the skin and sent a slow, creeping chill through the bones. He wanted to wake Emily, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat was locked tight, his limbs heavy, as if the same unseen force that had pressed down on his chest now held the rest of him in place. A deep, suffocating dread wrapped around him, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. Then the whisper came, not from the figure, but from the air itself, slipping through the darkness like an exhale. Soft, breathy, indistinct, but there. Jason squeezed his eyes shut. No, he didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to know what it was saying. But the whisper came again. Low, almost conversational, just above the edge of hearing. The cadence was steady, familiar in a way Jason couldn't explain, like listening to an old recording played too softly to make out the words. The pressure lifted suddenly, and Jason gasped as if he'd been held underwater. His limbs were his own again. The weight on his chest was gone, the air thinner but still clinging with the faint, stale scent of tobacco. He shot up in bed, gulping in breath, turning quickly toward the doorway. Nothing, just the dim outline of the dresser. The door cracked open slightly, leading into the blackened hallway. Emily stirred beside him. Jason. Her voice was thick with sleep. He swallowed, his throat dry. Yeah, just bad dream. She hummed in response, already fading back into sleep, but Jason didn't move. He sat there, staring into the dark, his pulse still a sharp, erratic thrum in his ears. It had felt real, more real than anything he had ever dreamed before. And the house still felt occupied. The next morning, Jason kept quiet about what had happened. Emily was already halfway through her coffee when he joined her in the kitchen, her laptop open, skimming real estate listings. I don't want to panic or anything, she started, glancing up at him. But, do you think we should have checked out the history of this house before we bought it? Jason's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Emily turned the screen toward him. I just searched George Maharis' name. Look at this. He leaned in, scanning the article. Maharis had lived in the house for decades, but the last few years of his life had been marked by isolation rarely seen in public, withdrawing from friends, claiming he wasn't feeling well. He had grown increasingly paranoid, according to one neighbor, complained about voices in the house, about someone watching him when he was alone. His cause of death had been natural, but something about the way the article phrased his final years made Jason's skin prickle. Emily exhaled. I don't know. It's just weird, right? Maybe it's nothing. Jason hesitated, then forced a chuckle. Yeah, just old house stuff. But he wasn't so sure. And later that night, when the TV turned on by itself, an old rerun of Route 66 flickering across the screen, soundless he knew. The house wasn't empty. Not at all. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The glow of the television bathed the darkened living room in shifting monochrome, casting sharp-edged shadows against the walls. The screen flickered, images dancing between static and clarity, but the sound remained eerily absent. Jason stood in the doorway, his breath shallow. On the screen, two men leaned against a gleaming Corvette, exchanging words he couldn't hear. Route 66. He had never seen an episode before, but he knew. Maharis is on that screen. He's watching himself. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched. The TV had turned on by itself. Jason took a slow step forward. A floorboard creaked beneath him, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. Winston, curled on the rug near the couch, lifted his head with a low, uneasy whine. Jason reached for the remote, fingers hesitant, like touching it might confirm something he wasn't ready to admit. As soon as his hand closed around it, the TV clicked off. The room plunged into darkness. The silence was thick, stretched too long, pressing in around him. And then, the whisper, not from behind him, not from another room. It was in his ear, close, intimate, a single breath of sound, indistinct but deliberate. Jason recoiled violently, nearly stumbling over the coffee table as he spun around. His pulse slammed against his ribs, his breath a sharp, ragged thing. The darkness behind him felt full, the air charged with something unseen. He fumbled for the lamp on the side table, fingers shaking, knocking over a glass in his haste. The moment the light flooded the room, the feeling vanished. No one was there. Winston was now sitting up, his ears pinned back, staring at the same empty space Jason had just turned from. His tail was rigid, his body tense. Jason swallowed hard. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was here. Something that didn't want to be forgotten. The next morning, Jason didn't mention the incident to Emily. He didn't want to fuel the growing unease that had settled between them. But the silence between them spoke volumes. She felt it too. The house had changed. It wasn't just the flickering lights, the smell of cigarette smoke, or the static-laced voices at night. It was something deeper, like the walls had become aware of them, like the space they occupied was no longer theirs alone. Jason found himself drawn back to the den later that afternoon, standing at the threshold. It was the only room in the house that felt older than the rest. The air here was thick, undisturbed, the kind of stillness that suggested it belonged to another time. He let out a slow breath and stepped inside. The room was lined with bookshelves, the spines worn, their pages yellowing. Maharis had spent most of his final years in this space, surrounded by relics of a past he had once been famous for. Jason let his fingertips brush over a stack of old scripts on the desk, brittle with age. A faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air. Jason turned his head sharply. The leather armchair Maharis' chair stood in the corner, empty but imposing. And then, a sound. Soft, rhythmic. The unmistakable creak of someone settling into a seat. Jason's breath caught. The chair had moved. Only slightly. Just enough. The leather still groaned, the weight of an unseen occupant sinking into its worn embrace. A breath of cold air brushed his cheek. And this time the whisper was clear. A single word. Low. Faint. Stay. Jason turned and ran. Jason didn't stop running until he reached the sunlit kitchen. His breath ragged, hands braced against the counter. His whole body buzzed with the urge to move, to leave, to get out, but his legs locked beneath him. His mind fought to rationalize what had happened. The chair didn't move. I imagined it. The whisper wasn't real, but the memory of it coiled around his throat, tightening with every replay in his mind. Stay. The word hadn't been a request. It had been a command. The scent of cigarette smoke trailed after him, clinging to the air, refusing to dissipate. The house wasn't just haunted, it was awake, aware of him, aware of Emily, aware of their presence like a host inspecting unwelcome guests. And Jason had a sinking feeling that the house wasn't ready to let them go. Emily's voice snapped him back to the present. Jason! He turned sharply. She stood by the kitchen island, a concerned furrow between her brows. A half-empty glass of water rested in her hand, but her grip on it was tight, her knuckles pale. What's wrong? She asked. Jason opened his mouth, then hesitated. How did he even begin to explain? That the house was watching them? That he had heard something that wasn't there? That the chair in the den had? I don't think we should stay here, he blurted before he could stop himself. Emily's eyes widened. Jason swallowed. Just for a few days. Get a hotel. Take a break. Emily set the glass down slowly. Jason. He knew the tone. It was the one she used when she was about to reason her way out of something she didn't want to acknowledge. Come on, Em. You feel it too. She shook her head, but there was hesitation in her stance, a tightness around her mouth. He pressed on. The house isn't right. We've both been hearing things. Winston, he won't even go into some rooms. Last night, he stopped himself. Just let's leave. Just for a little while. She exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. You want this place to be haunted. Jason blinked. What? You've been obsessed with it ever since the weird stuff started happening. She sighed, crossing her arms. I think you're looking for ghosts because you want to find them. Jason stared at her. Was that what she thought? He said, his voice quieter. Something whispered in my ear last night. Her face paled slightly, but she didn't back down. You were half asleep. Something sat in that chair in the den. She stiffened, her jaw tightening, her arms gripping herself a little harder. She believed him. She just didn't want to. A deep silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, from the hallway, a creak. Slow, deliberate, the sound of weight shifting on an old floorboard. Jason and Emily locked eyes. Neither of them had moved. Another creak. Closer this time. Emily let out a shaky breath. Tell me you heard that. Jason didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the hallway entrance, where the shadows stretched long across the floor, and where, for just a fraction of a second, he could have sworn he saw the outline of a figure standing just beyond view. Jason couldn't move. His breath felt caught, suspended somewhere deep in his chest, as if even the smallest sound might draw attention to the fact that he had seen it. The figure in the hallway, or had he? The shadows still lay thick against the floor, stretching from the late afternoon light filtering through the windows. No movement now, no whisper of fabric shifting, no breath breaking the silence. But he knew what he had seen or thought he had seen. Emily stood beside him, stiff and silent, her arms now wrapped tightly around herself, fingers digging into her own skin. She had heard the creaks, felt the unnatural weight in the air, but she hadn't seen. Jason wished he hadn't either. Winston let out a low whimper from the living room, his body flattened against the floor, ears pinned back. His tail was tucked so far between his legs it almost disappeared. He was staring at the same spot Jason had just been looking at, the place where the figure had stood. Jason forced himself to take a breath. Felt too loud, like the house itself was listening. Let's go, he whispered. Emily didn't argue this time. They moved carefully, as if sudden motion might wake whatever presence lurked within the walls. Jason grabbed the car keys off the counter. Emily snatched her purse from the table. Winston stayed low to the ground as they approached the front door, his paws silent against the hardwood. The weight in the air pressed heavier now, as though the house knew what they were about to do. Jason reached for the doorknob. The lights flickered. A hum of electricity ran through the walls, a vibration Jason could feel in his bones. The air grew dense, thick with something unseen. Then, the television in the living room burst to life. The sudden flash of black and white images illuminated the space, casting long shadows that moved. The speakers hissed with static before cutting to a voice faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Jason and Emily froze. On the screen, an old episode of Route 66 played, the grainy image of George Maharis staring back at them. And then, the voice on the television spoke, low and steady. Not from the show, not part of the script. It spoke to them. Why are you leaving? Emily let out a strangled sound, half gasp, half sob. Jason didn't answer. He didn't even think. He grabbed Emily's wrist, yanked the door open, and dragged her outside. They didn't look back, not even when the door slammed shut behind them. Jason didn't stop until they were in the car, doors locked, Winston trembling in the backseat. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, silent and still, yet somehow watching. They checked into a hotel that night. Neither spoke much. Emily kept rubbing her arms like she was trying to shake off something invisible. Jason kept replaying the voice on the television, distorted, deliberate. Why are you leaving? They never spent another night in that house. The next morning, Jason called a realtor. Within a month, the property was back on the market. They didn't even return to pack their things. Movers handled it. Jason never asked if they heard anything while they were inside. The house sold quickly. The new owners never reached out, never complained, never made headlines. But late at night, Jason still dreamt of it. Of the den, the creaking chair, the cold whisper at his ear. And of George Maharis watching himself on television never really gone. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.